Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So, alhamdulillah, today is our 8th class for the introduction into this Hadith sciences. And in today's class, our topic or our goal will be to introduce the most famous narrators amongst the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In particular, we will be looking at 8 companions. So we will just be briefly touching upon their life. It is a very brief session in a sense that there's not a lot of technical things going on during this session. And it's just more of a biography or just introducing certain companions that we constantly hear of, especially when it comes to the narration of hadith. So as usual, we'll start with a brief recap of our last week's session. Let me pull up the chart. So we did send out a chart or a PDF with what we did last time. So we spoke about how to analyze a sanad or the chain. And we spoke about the methods that, or the subjects that extend from that. So we spoke about ilm al-rijal, which is the biographies of the people in the chain of narration. So a sanad is a chain of narration, and within that chain there are names, right? So Arqam narrates from Muhammad, narrates from this person, narrates from the companion who narrates from the Prophet ﷺ. Each and every single individual, the information about their life, and particularly their birth, the date of their birth, the place of their birth, their death, the place of their death, and the date of their death. These are the most vital information when it comes to this, and then anything else about their lives as well. And then we said there's another science that closely relates to this, and this is the ilm or the science of al-jarh wa ta'adil. And we said jarh and ta'adil, they're two different things. Jarh is to linguistically to harm something, to stab something, to hurt something, to injure something. That's a jarh. And the purpose behind the jarh in the science of hadith is to kind of attack the reputation of a certain narrator, that this person, he was known for lying, or this was said about his reputation, therefore this hadith is weak. So it's a method of critiquing the chain. The opposite is a ta'adil. So a ta'adil linguistically is to set straight or to make something straight. And the purpose of that in the hadith science is to fix, you can kind of say, the reputation of an individual. And that's why it's translated as validation, to validate a certain chain. So a jarh wa ta'adil is to critique or validate that chain. And this is the science itself. Then we spoke about some of the methods that are used in terms of when a person is performing jarh and ta'dil of a certain chain. And we said there's two major categories that people look at. The first is al-adala and the second is al-dabt, not in any specific order. The first, al-adala, is in terms of that person's character, their moral ground, in terms of whether that person is known for lying, whether that person is honest, what's said about that person's reputation. So that goes in terms of the person themselves. The second is abduct, and that usually deals with the person's ability to recall, to memorize, to preserve the hadith that they're learning. And that goes not so much so towards their character reputation, but rather more towards their ability of preserving the hadith itself. So that's al-adala and al-dabt. And these are what we spoke about. We then went into a little more detail into certain qualities or certain characteristics that can weaken a person's dabt and that can weaken a person's adala. So that is a general overview of what we spoke about during the last class. All right, so moving on to today's class, which is about the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. The idea, as I mentioned, is just to briefly introduce the companions. So it's a very light class. It's not filled with technical details or anything of that sort. So anybody want to try and guess? We're going to cover 8 companions, and we're going to cover them on the basis of being the most famous companions in terms of narrations by numbers. So in terms of the most amount of narrations or the most important narrations, you can kind of say. That's how we're going to cover these 8. So anybody want to guess the first companion on this list in terms of the most hadith narrated by any companion? This is quite an easy one. Okay, I have Abu Huraira as one of the answers. Anybody else? Anybody with any other thoughts that it could be somebody else? Okay. I have another answer with Abu Huraira. All right. So that is the correct answer. Abu Huraira radiallahu an is the companion who's narrated the most amount of hadith in comparison to any other companion, almost by double to the person who comes in second place, or actually over double than the person who comes in second place. Um, I believe, let me see if the number is exactly double. Yeah, it's about double. So Abu Huraira radiallahu an, he's narrated about 5,374. And again, these precise numbers, because sometimes some people calculate a certain hadith that have different wording as separate or whatnot. So we can round it off to about 5,300 and around that amount. That this is the amount of hadith that are narrated or attributed to Abu Huraira radiallahu an. Now, Abu Huraira radiallahu an, that is not his actual name. Anybody know Abu Huraira's real name, his actual name? Anybody want to take a try at that? It's a very light class, so go ahead, drop your answers in. Let's see how much we can recall. Maybe we've come across it somewhere. So Abu Huraira is what he's known by and his laqab, but his actual name is, and also even if you're not writing it, it's really good to say it out loud to yourself, or to, if you're watching this with family members or whatnot, to test one another, just to kind of quiz yourselves as well. And it helps you remember better in terms of saying it out loud or repeating it. So his actual name is Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr. And this is the most famous narration of his name. There are other narrations that his name was something else, but it's pretty much the most popular opinion that his name is Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr, and that was his nickname was Abu Huraira radiallahu an. Now, Abu Huraira, as we said, he's at the top. He's narrated over 5,000 hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and majority of this is because of his dedication. So Abu Huraira actually converted and met the Prophet ﷺ in the 7th year of Hijrah. So if you notice, he wasn't with the Prophet ﷺ for the Meccan period at all. And even for the Madani period, you're seeing that he joins the Prophet ﷺ in the 7th year of Hijrah. And this was during the time of Khaybar. He was told that the Prophet ﷺ is at Khaybar, so he goes there and he accepts Islam with the Prophet ﷺ. From that moment on, what he did was he sacrificed everything else. He gave up on everything else and he just dedicated his time, full time, to studying the words of the Prophet ﷺ, to spending time with the Prophet ﷺ, and he would stay in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. So in the masjid, and you'll see one or two more narrators that we'll speak about today, stayed in this area as well. There's a platform. It's almost as a raised platform. Some people translate it to a type of balcony, but it's a raised platform that was in the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, known as Sufa. And the people that would stay there were known as the Ashab al-Sufa, the people of this raised platform. And usually the individuals that would stay there were orphans, were people who were poor, didn't have anywhere to stay. Many times, in contemporary standards, homeless individuals, people that didn't have a dwelling of their own, they would go and stay in this particular area of the masjid, which was known as the Sufa. And the Prophet ﷺ specifically established that area for those individuals. And a lot of people who were spending their time and dedicating their time completely studying and not doing anything else. And as you could probably tell, Abu Huraira at this time was not married. So many people that stayed there, or majority of the people that stayed there, were unmarried as well, and poor citizens of the Madani society at the time. So the Prophet ﷺ established this area for these individuals, and there was a large group that dedicated their time to studying the words of the Prophet ﷺ. One of those individuals, and the most famous of those individuals, is Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh. So he's from the Ashab al-Suffah. He's from the people of this raised platform, and he stayed and lived and dedicated his time in the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, it's narrated that Abu Hurairah used to divide his night into three parts. One was for sleeping, one was for prayer, and the third one was for study. So every night, this was his schedule. He used to, divide into three parts. He used to sleep a little bit, he used to study, and he used to pray. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Hurairah was appointed as the governor of Bahrain. And then after that, he was also appointed as the governor of Medina during the Umayyad period. So during the period of Umar ibn al-Khattab, he was actually appointed in Bahrain. And then during the Umayyad period, he was appointed as the governor of Medina. And Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, he died in 59 after Hijrah. Approximately, let's see if I have a date here, 678 from what I have here in terms of the calendar that we use. So the Prophet ﷺ, once he passed away, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh began teaching many of the tabi'een and even the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. It's said that he had approximately 800 students. So Abu Hurairah had 800 students in Hadith, and the chains of these narrations go through Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh. And even the other day when we looked at one of the examples of the sanad, we saw, I think, 4 or 5 companions on top. But majority of the chains, they spread out from Abu Hurairah, right? In that chart that we looked at, majority, the bulk of it went down through Abu Hurairah. And then the other companions that we had there, the other 3 or 4 companions that we had, all had like 1 or 2 chains going through them for that particular hadith. So Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, without a doubt, had one of the most amount of students, one of the most amount of dedication when it came to preserving the hadith and passing down the hadith as well. Now, what's interesting about Abu Hurairah is because of the large amount of hadith that's narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, by default, it's easier for people to make up hadith and attribute it to Abu Hurairah, right? Because Abu Hurairah, there's all these chains going back to Abu Hurairah. There's so many hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah. And I'm sure even we constantly hear on the authority of Abu Hurairah or narrated by Abu Hurairah. So by default, if somebody's trying to make up a hadith, one of the easiest chains to make up, or one of the easiest hadith to make up, is attributing it to Abu Hurairah. Not that Abu Hurairah obviously did not make up hadith, of course not. But if somebody's trying to make up a hadith, they would attribute it. It's an easy option to attribute it to Abu Hurairah, and kind of makes sense that you're constantly hearing Abu Hurairah narrated, oh, this person heard from Abu Hurairah. So now if I want to make something up, my best bet, my best option would be to make it up in the name of Abu Hurairah. So you'll find many hadith that would be classified as weak because of that, not because of Abu Hurairah, but because of other individuals in the chain that do not meet the standards that we discussed in the last class. So somebody in the chain might be considered a liar or whatnot. It's just a side note that you'll see this as well. Now, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, we did a story about him in our previous sessions when the Khalifa Marwan invited Abu Hurairah, right? And we were discussing in terms of the memory of many of the narrators. When the Khalifa invited Abu Hurairah and he had a scribe hiding behind a curtain, and Abu Hurairah recited and narrated hadith, then a year later he called him back again, and this was to test him. And Abu Hurairah narrated the exact same hadith in the same order, in the same sequence and everything, and as was preserved by the scribe. So this was one of the stories that's mentioned about Abu Hurairah in terms of his preservation, in terms of his scholarship, in terms of his memory as well. Now, this is the general overview of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh. Moving on to our second narrator. Anybody want to guess who's the second narrator here in terms of the bulk of hadith? I have some answers coming in. I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to a minute. Nobody's got it yet. So all the ones that are coming in, um, they're not correct for the second most amount of narrations. Even if you don't know, if you have a hunch, go for it. All right. So none of these answers are correct. The second most narrations comes from Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anh, the son of the second Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. Okay, I'll get to that question at the end. There's a question here about hadith, inshallah. So we'll get to that towards the end. So the second most amount of hadith comes from Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu an, and this is 2,630 narrations from Abdullah ibn Umar. Also, at the end of the class, I will send you a list from one of the books that has a compilation of the amount of hadith from many of the companions. So it has way more than what we're going to cover today, but it starts with the least amount of narrations all the way until Abu Hurairah radiallahu an, and it's a very interesting list to look at. So I will send you that after class as well. Okay, so Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu an, he is the son of the second Khalifa. He became Muslim and accepted Islam around the same time as his father. So we know the story of Umar radiallahu an accepting Islam, and this was in Mecca when he went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's house or whatnot. So this was the same time, around the same time that his son Abdullah ibn Umar accepted Islam as well. And he also immigrated to Medina alongside his father as well. During the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime, Abdullah ibn Umar, he participated in many of the campaigns, many of the battles, the wars that took place, and even after the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, many of the battles that took place, Abdullah ibn Umar took an active part in all of that. Now, during the period of what's known as the fitna, the civil wars that took place after the death of Uthman radiallahu an, Abdullah ibn Umar remained strictly neutral. So he remained strictly neutral and he didn't take any sides, and he was known to be extremely neutral in his approach to all of it. He was asked by many Muslims throughout time to become the Khalifa, which he turned down on multiple occasions. Now, Abdullah ibn Umar specifically was requested by his father not to become Khalifa as well. So Umar radiallahu an, he told Abdullah ibn Umar not to take this position, even though he was well qualified. So Abdullah ibn Umar was well qualified. He was a respected companion amongst the other companions as well. He was well educated, well knowledgeable about the Prophet's hadith, but he specifically didn't take the khilafah or leadership in any role. And this was one of the reasons behind this was that Umar radiallahu anh didn't want to start a monarchy. So he didn't want it to be that Umar becomes Khalifa, and because he's such a good Khalifa, they appoint his son, and then later on his son and his son or whatnot. So he requested Abdullah ibn Umar that don't, take this position, that one person from our family serving this position is enough, even though Abdullah ibn Umar was qualified to hold such a position. Abdullah ibn Umar, he passed away in the year 74 after Hijrah, which is 692, at the age of 87. So that's when he passed away. And he was known to be pretty much the ideal citizen, that he was righteous, he kept to himself, he didn't go into people's business or anything like that. So he was known to be an ideal citizen. And he was also known for his scholarship during his lifetime, that he would study, and whenever he would narrate a hadith, he would be very careful at what he's saying and what he's narrating. And it was known that his eyes would be filled with tears at times when he would narrate the words of the Prophet ﷺ. So this quality of his of narrating hadith with extreme care it was well known about him that he would be extremely cautious when narrating the words of the Prophet ﷺ. He would not want to mess up or exchange or anything in terms of the specific words of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so that's our second companion. And then we have a third companion coming around very close in terms of numbers of hadith narrated. Anybody want to take a try who this could be? While you guys are guessing, I'll answer this question that's here, which is, so how do you know, how do you go about knowing for sure a particular hadith was not actually narrated by Abu Hurairah? So nowadays for us is very easy. And that's because majority of the hadith are classified already. So they're already classified and tell you that this hadith is sahih or this hadith is da'if. So for example, if there's a hadith that you'll find in Bukhari, generally the chain of narration would be sahih. Whether it's applicable, again, that's a different aspect of it, but the hadith itself will be sahih. So you don't have to be worried about whether the hadith itself is made up or not. So that for us, it's very easy. But in terms of the hadith scholars, when they looked at it, a lot of hadith that would be made up, people would attribute it to Abu Hurairah. And they would do that because of the easy access of his narrations that, oh, Abu Hurairah said this, Abu Hurairah said that. So for us, we don't really face that problem of having to worry about a made up hadith. We still have made up hadith that people use, right? So people still use made up hadith in stories, which is not allowed. You're not allowed to use a hadith that's mawdu'a, that's clearly fabricated. It's not permissible. It's not a weak hadith where you can even use it for fada'il, meaning to encourage good deeds. So made up hadith are not permitted to be used for even encouraging good deeds. That, oh, if you go feed the homeless, you get this much reward. If the hadith is weak and it encourages good deeds and it's not extremely weak, you can use it for those purposes. But if a hadith is made up, it's not permissible, and it's actually haram for you to say that the Prophet ﷺ said this, knowing that this hadith is made up. So for us, many times, again, it's already classified that it's da'if or it's mawdu'a. So it'll tell you that this hadith is mawdu'a. All right, so I have some answers here. Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Aisha radiyallahu an. So Aisha is a very good guess, right? Aisha is a very good guess. She's coming up. She's not number 3 though. Aisha radiallahu an is coming up, but she is not number 3. Let's see. Okay. So number 3 is Anas ibn Malik radiallahu an. So Anas ibn Malik radiallahu an, he's narrated 2,286 hadith. 2,286 hadith. And the numbers that, again, the numbers that I'm using are from this specific book. I think it's one of the books that I recommended in the beginning, but it is also the handout that I will give you. I'll give it to you from the specific book as well. Okay, so Anas ibn Malik, right? So Anas ibn Malik, the story with Anas ibn Malik radiallahu an, he is a companion of the Prophet ﷺ that was given by his mother. Sulaym is the mother of Anas ibn Malik. She gave him to the Prophet ﷺ service at the age of 10, right, to help around with household work or whatnot when the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina. And from that time on, Anas ibn Malik, he attended the Prophet ﷺ, and many of the hadith that are narrated about specific actions of the Prophet ﷺ, they're from Anas ibn Malik because he saw this. So Anas, for example, would help the Prophet ﷺ do wudu, right? So he's seen the Prophet ﷺ constantly do wudu, and he's seen the Prophet ﷺ, how he would bring the water to the Prophet ﷺ or whatnot. So all of that is observed by Anas ibn Malik. So a lot of these hadith he'll narrate, he'll say, I saw the Prophet ﷺ doing this, or I saw, or once I brought this to the Prophet ﷺ, or I, did this for the Prophet ﷺ. So all of that is kind of first-hand observation from Anas ibn Malik. But at the very beginning, he was very young. He was 10 years old at the time that his mother presented him to the Prophet ﷺ. And this was following the migration. So this was in the beginning of the Madani period, which means that he passed away, or when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he was in his 20s, right? So he was in his, around almost towards his mid-20s when the Prophet ﷺ passed away. And he was the Prophet ﷺ's, one of the Prophet ﷺ's favorites. So the Prophet ﷺ would take him, to places or whatnot. And after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he also was appointed by Abu Bakr radiallahu an as a tax collector. So later on, he became a tax collector specifically in the lands of Bahrain. So it's still currently it's in the Khalij area, and he would be a tax collector there. Then later on, he moved to Basra, which is modern day Iraq, and he passed away in Basra as well over the age of 100. So he was one of the oldest companions, which is the year of 711, and he was one of the oldest companions to pass away, and one of the last companions, if not, one of the last few, handful of companions that passed away. Some even mentioned the last companion to pass away or whatnot, but Allahu A'lam, Allah knows best who specifically is the last person to pass away out of the companions. He spent about 10 years in the Prophet ﷺ service, right? So we said right after Hijrah, which gives us 10 years approximately, that he served the Prophet ﷺ. And during that time, he memorized many hadith, he observed many hadith. And when he passed away, it was mentioned that this was almost as a kind of like a death blow to the tradition, right? To the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ, because he understood and knew the Prophet ﷺ so well, and he observed the Prophet ﷺ so closely, that many of the other companions never got the opportunity to observe. So he was well regarded in terms of his hadith tradition and his transmissions. And many of his hadith, like we said, are observational hadith as well, which serve a very important purpose for the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So that is number 3. Okay, let's move on to number 4. I actually have a list that I wrote it out for you guys, all 8, but I don't want to put it up there because I want you guys to try to guess which one at least are the first 5. And then we'll open, I'll screen share so you have the list of the 8 companions that we're doing today. So go ahead. Let's take a guess at number 4. And these are close. So Anas ibn, Abdullah ibn Umar is 2,600 hadith. Anas ibn Malik, we said 2,200 and something. And Aisha radiallahu anh, she's number 4, which is 2,210. So Aisha radiallahu anha is number 4. And Aisha is a companion that many of us are familiar with. She's the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, so al-Mu'mineen Aisha radiallahu anha. She is number 4 in terms of the most amount of narrations from the Prophet ﷺ. She passed away approximately in the year 678, according to some narrations, and at the age of 65, if you base it off of that narration. Now, Aisha radiallahu anha, what's unique about her is that she's not only blessed with a strong memory, she also, had a unique ability to kind of critically analyze a lot of the hadith works, and she was a specialist in that manner in Islamic law as well. So Aisha radiallahu anha, many companions, right there, some companions, for example, are specialists in the words of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning hadith. Some companions were specialists in the Quran, right, like Zayd radiallahu anh. Some companions were specialists in tafsir, and some were specialists in Islamic law and fiqh. Aisha radiallahu anha, what was unique about her was that she was very well versed with the hadith, and she was extremely good at Islamic law. So she's one of the major sources of Islamic law and one of the major authorities when it came to Islamic law. And at the same time, she was good in tafsir as well. So she was good in tafsir. So she had a grasp of all of these sciences. And I'll get towards the end, actually. I'll come back to this. But she was also well known for her memorization of Arabic poetry. So not just in Islamic science, but ancient Arabic poetry. And she's memorized a large number of these traditional or ancient Arabic poetry as well, or poems. So she was well known for that. She was also classified as somewhat of an expert in certain medicinal sciences of the time. So she is well versed in all of these different sciences. So she's not just focusing on one thing during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or even after the Prophet ﷺ. And again, Aisha radiallahu anha, she has one of the strongest critical thinking abilities amongst the companions in comparison to the companions as well. And at many times she corrects the companions. So this is a strong here. This is a perfect example of when I say that the hadith could be sahih, but it does not mean it's applicable. One of these examples comes from the methodology that's employed by Aisha radiallahu anha. So on many occasions, it's preserved that a companion would narrate a hadith and Aisha would correct them. So a companion would narrate the hadith and Aisha would correct them. And this was done for various reasons. Again, this is some of these examples we're actually going to bring up in our talk towards the end on fiqh and hadith, right? This crossover between hadith and fiqh. But Aisha radiallahu anha, there's many occasions that a companion would narrate something and she would correct them. And this would be due to many factors. One of them being that the companion didn't hear the whole hadith. So a certain companion would walk in while the Prophet is already in the middle of a conversation and they would hear the end of it or whatever it may be. So she would then go on and correct that companion and say that's false. She would also correct certain companions by using logical arguments. And this is very, very important because this is a method of fiqh. And people who don't understand this concept within fiqh think that people who employ logical arguments against certain hadith are just making this idea up that you can use logical arguments to kind of not act upon that hadith or whatnot. This was a method done by Aisha. It's well preserved that this was used by Aisha radiallahu anha. So there's a hadith that states, or I'll paraphrase the portion of the hadith that we need, and it mentions that that when a woman crosses somebody while they're praying, it breaks their wudu or breaks their salah. I don't recall correctly, so I don't want to misquote the hadith, but one of the two. And I believe it breaks their salah. I don't remember correctly though. And Aisha radiallahu anha actually says this is false. Like this, this hadith makes no sense in terms of fiqh, and she completely disregards the hadith. She says it's false. Like it goes against logic or whatnot. And she also says, are you comparing women to these other things that break the salah or whatnot? So she disregards this hadith and she doesn't take it. And later on, schools of fiqh use this argument to say that hadith is not applicable. You don't act upon it because Aisha radiallahu anha rebuts that hadith by logical arguments and says this is not a correct understanding. So there are many, and that's just one example. There's another example when one of the companions narrates, and these are famous companions, by the way. It's just sometimes Aisha would have to correct their understanding of certain things. So there's a narration by Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, who's made the list that we spoke about, and he's made second place in terms of the list. And he says that, and this was corrected during his lifetime. So he said that he heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say that the dead are punished in their graves on account of the crying of their relatives. Right? And Aisha radiallahu anha, she points out and she said the Prophet ﷺ didn't say that. The Prophet ﷺ said that while the dead are being punished in their graves for their sins, their relatives are weeping for them. So you see the minor difference in understanding. So Aisha radiallahu anha corrects that hadith and she points out to him, she says that's not what the hadith said. That's not what the Prophet ﷺ said. Rather, he said that at the same time that the dead are being punished, their relatives are crying. And it logically also makes sense because we believe that a person is not going to be punished for somebody else's actions. So if you were to say that because of somebody else crying, right, because of somebody else crying, I'm being punished in my grave. I don't have control of that. So why am I being punished for that? So again, these are, and Aisha is a wonderful example to read into this in terms of her corrections of many hadith and her usage of logical arguments to rebut certain hadith or whatnot. She's a wonderful example of this, and in terms of her critical thinking as well. Okay, so let us look at the next person. So I think that's 4 so far. Go ahead, take a shot at who is next, who's number 5 on the list, and then we'll put it up. That's a good guess. It is Abdullah ibn Abbas. Sorry, I don't know if that was a guess or you knew, but that's a good answer. That is the correct answer. Let me share my screen so you have this list and you can screenshot it as well. These are the names that we're going through, by the way. All right. So hopefully it's shared for you guys. I'm going to go back over here. Let me open up the chat. Okay. All right. Somebody just let me know if it's shared so then we can continue. Are we good? Okay, perfect. Bismillah. So Abdullah ibn Abbas, he is number 5 for us. And Abdullah ibn Abbas, he was born 3 years before the Prophet ﷺ moved to Medina. So meaning at the time of the Prophet ﷺ's death, he was about 13 years old. And because of this reason, Abdullah ibn Abbas, there's not, in terms of the wideness of hadith that are attributed to some of these other companions who spent a longer time, it's not in the same way. So he's narrated about 1,300 hadith, and some of them, some scholars say it's even fewer if you look at the repetitions or whatnot. And they say that there are, the 1,300 hadith, if you look at the ones that come directly from him to the Prophet. So let me correct that. Come from him to the Prophet ﷺ directly, that I heard the Prophet ﷺ said, or the Prophet ﷺ said this, and we'll see the reason why. But some scholars mention that he's only directly narrated 10, 20, 30, like a very few amount of numbers directly from the Prophet ﷺ. The other ones are narrated from other companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So remember, we spoke about, I think 2 classes ago or so, that sometimes a sanad doesn't mean that the companion is saying, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say. It could be, I heard the Prophet ﷺ said, and it could mean that they heard from another companion. Or sometimes they would mention the other companion by name, that I learned from this companion that the Prophet ﷺ said. And they could both be companions. And we gave the example that Umar radiallahu anh and his neighbor used to take turns, and they used to teach each other what they learned from the halaqah that day from the Prophet ﷺ. So Abdullah ibn Abbas, he learned a lot from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. He was born 3 years before Hijrah, meaning he lived the 10 years of Medina with the Prophet ﷺ, and he passed away at the age, or the Prophet ﷺ passed away when he was only about 13 years old. Now, even at a very young age, Abdullah ibn Abbas, even at a very young age, he was extremely talented. So Umar radiallahu anh, it's mentioned that he would take him to the gathering of, it's kind of like the political discussions that are going on, kind of like the elders, that they would get together, talk and make decisions or whatnot. Umar radiallahu anh, the second Khalifa, he took Abdullah ibn Abbas with him to this gathering. And he posed a question. In the beginning, people were questioning, why are you bringing this young child here? Right? This is, all of us are adults, all of us are older, of a lot older age as well. These discussions are a higher level or whatnot. So he posed a question, and then none of them were able to answer it adequately. So he asked Abdullah ibn Abbas, he said, what do you think? And Abdullah ibn Abbas started narrating, and he started explaining and breaking it down. So he was extremely talented at a very young age. And at that time, it was during the time of Umar, so he was very likely either around the age of 20-ish, right? So if he was 13 at the time of the Prophet was passing away, you're looking at the beginning of Umar's time, about 16, 17, and depending on exactly when that story took place, you're looking at 17 to 27, that age group. Okay, so Abdullah ibn Abbas, there's also narrations about him. There's a lot that can be said about him, but there's a few narrations that I want to mention. One of the things that Abdullah ibn Abbas did, soon as the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he dedicated his time to taking knowledge from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and specifically from those that were closest to the Prophet ﷺ. So what he would do is, and the stories of Abdullah ibn Abbas seeking knowledge is amazing. That itself is something to read on. What he would do is he would go and wait in front of, let's say he wanted to learn from a certain companion or learn a certain hadith, he would go and wait in front of that companion's door. And he would wait until that person comes out. And this is recorded in the narrations. And they would say, oh, Abdullah ibn Abbas, oh, cousin of the Prophet, what do you need? You could have woke me up. You could have just, knocked or anything like that. I would have came out and attended to you. And he would say, that's not from the respect in seeking knowledge, that this is something that I am trying to attain. So it requires patience, it requires respect. And he would wait in front of these companions' houses until they would wake up or until they would come out. And then he would have these discussions and learn different hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from them. Now, Abdullah ibn Abbas is not only well known for hadith, as most of you already know, he's well known for tafsir. So he's an expert in tafsir. And like Aisha radiallahu anha, he's also an expert in fiqh. So he's a scholar of fiqh as well. But he's a lot more known in tafsir. And his most famous student of tafsir, and a lot of his tafsir is preserved through his most famous student, Mujahid. Right? So the famous Mufassir Mujahid is the student of Abdullah ibn Abbas, and that's why he has very similar opinions in tafsir as Abdullah ibn Abbas as well. Now, Abdullah ibn Abbas's tafsir is not compiled into a book by him. A lot of it is preserved by his students, and you'll find it in many different books. So if you look at the traditional books of tafsir, like Tafsir al-Tabari, you'll find opinions of Abdullah ibn Abbas almost on any ayah that he has an opinion or that he has said something about. But there is modern books that you can get. There's a set of 8 volumes called Tafsir Makki, and it has the famous Makkan Mufassirin. One of them is Abdullah ibn Abbas, so has a volume dedicated to him, but it's a compilation of wherever there's tafsir by him into one book or one volume, and that can be found online as well, I believe. But I think it's I have the Arabic version. I don't know if it's translated or not. I don't believe it's translated. Okay. All right. So we have how many left? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in my notes. So we have 3 people left. The next one is Jabir ibn Abdullah. After Abdullah ibn Abbas is Jabir ibn Abdullah. Jabir ibn Abdullah has narrated 1,500 hadith. So there's 1,500 hadith attributed to Jabir ibn Abdullah. And Jabir is one of the earlier Madani converts to Islam. And he was part of, during the Prophet ﷺ's time in Mecca, there were 2 occasions where there were meetings with the Prophet ﷺ from the people of Medina. So they came and they had these discussions before the Prophet ﷺ moved. On the second meeting, Jabir ibn Abdullah was one of the companions that was present there. And he was part of many different expeditions during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. His lifetime, and he passed away in Medina in the year 74 after Hijrah at the age of about 94. Now, he also, like Abdullah ibn Abbas, not only studied with the Prophet ﷺ, but also studied with many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and in particular with Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, with Umar radiallahu anh. He directly studied the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from them. And he also studied with Kulthum, which is the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh as well. And one of the last things I'll say about him is that he taught hadith or he taught generally in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. So he was a companion, but he also taught in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of hadith or whatnot. Okay, the next companion, which is number, let me see, number 7 for us, is Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. So his name is Sa'ad ibn Malik radiallahu an, and he's also another early Madani convert. His father was killed during the Battle of Uhud, and he spent, was part of many different expeditions, many different battles during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. And he also passed away in Medina in the year of 64 after Hijrah, or in the year 64 after Hijrah, which is 683. Okay, so like Abu Hurairah radiallahu an, remember we said Abu Hurairah radiallahu an stayed at a certain area in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. Hopefully you remember the name. It's called As-Suffa, and the people that stay there are known as Ashab al-Suffa, the people of Suffa, this raised platform, also translated as a porch or a balcony, right? These are different English translations of it, but it's more similar to a raised platform in the Prophet's masjid. So he also stayed there. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he was also one of the companions that dedicated their time there. He was known to constantly spend time in prayer, in learning the words of the Prophet ﷺ, and learning the religion. He also studied with many of the companions like Abu Bakr radiallahu an, Umar radiallahu an, Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu an, and he was known to be one of the famous fuqaha, or one of the famous jurists amongst the younger companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So he was also known for fiqh as well. A famous hadith that you heard by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. I should have actually done that for each of the narrators. But the famous hadith, I think, if I remember correctly, it is Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, but I will double check for you guys. Let me actually pull it up. But it's the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi, fa in lam yastati' fa bilisanihi, fa in lam yastati' fa biqalbihi, wa dhalika adhafu al-iman." That whoever sees something evil, let them change it with their hand, right? Bring a physical change. If they're not able to do so, then by their tongue, a verbal change. If they're not able to do so, then let them feel bad about it in their heart, and that is the lowest of iman. But let me make sure that's Abu Sa'id al-Khudri's narration. Just so I don't misquote. It'll take me 1 second to Google it. Yep, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Alhamdulillah. So didn't misquote it. Just wanted to make sure. Don't want to give you the wrong information. So, all right. So the last companion that we'll look at, number 8 for us, is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. So he is the son of Amr ibn al-As. This name you should remember. Anybody remember why you should remember this name? He came up before in our class for a specific reason. Anybody remember or recall why? All right. So if you remember when we were talking about some of the companions who had written down hadith, he was one of the famous ones that had written it down in a book that he called As-Sahifa As-Sadiqa. So that was his book. So this is the companion that we're talking about, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. He was the son of the very famous companion Amr ibn al-As, and he's narrated, according to the list that we have here, 700 hadith. Just make sure, yeah, 700 hadith. So he was also one of the early converts to Islam, and we're talking about the Meccan period, and he lived and participated with the Prophet ﷺ through the various battles that the Prophet ﷺ went through. And Abdullah, he was known to, very, very similar to Abdullah ibn Umar, that he was known to be an ideal citizen, that he wouldn't get involved in issues of other people or anything of that sort. He would most of the time focus on himself, on studying, on preserving the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why he kind of compiled this book, this private collection that he had, known as As-Sahifa As-Sadiqa, the truthful Sahifa, this collection. And he, lived in different areas during his lifetime. So at times he lived in Egypt, at times he lived in Ta'if, and he was known for prayer, for teaching hadith, and a lot of narrations are attributed to him. Obviously not as much as the other companions we mentioned, but he's one of the famous companions that left behind a work. And as we mentioned before, that a lot of his work, the book that he collected, or the personal work that he collected, was incorporated into Imam Ahmad's book, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So that is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, and that is our last companion that we will discuss for the day. I hope the class was not too heavy of a class, inshallah. So let us open it for Q&A. Let me stop the YouTube video, and then we got time for Q&A, inshallah.